Okay, my first guest in the history of this podcast is Amy Wax. Um, Amy doesn't need much of an introduction. I think everyone knows who she is. Chair Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, has had an illustrious career in law and academia. In the last several years, she's known for something which I am now known for, which is the desire that leftists have for her to be fired. I first contacted Amy about 3 years ago when I was working on my article, Four Reasons Why Heterodox Academy Failed. Heterodox Academy is, of course, the supposed defender of heterodoxy in the academy. Their purpose, their mission is to promote viewpoint diversity for people with non-orthodox views, which one would think might include somebody like Amy. However, at the Heterodox Academy conferences, there have been speakers, panels commenting on how it's desirable for Amy to not be allowed to teach required courses, with the other panelists nodding in agreement, no pushback. Of course, Heterodox Academy has never, as far as anyone could tell, done anything to come to Amy's defense, although her case was a very high-profile example of attempted suppression, retaliation against a professor for expressing their views. So, in the last 3 years, has Heterodox Academy done anything to help our situation?
Well, not really. I mean, I will say that at the beginning, at the inception of the charges, the filing of charges against me at Penn and Penn Law by my dean, um, Jonathan Haidt did say some positive things about me or came to my defense to some extent early on. So there were a few statements that he made that I considered helpful or supportive. That was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly what he said. But then it looked like heterodox became more a kind of soft and conciliatory towards the powers that be in academia, and the little sessions that you have alluded to occurred, which really made me feel like they didn't understand what was at stake and that they were um, trying to compromise too much with this lefty position, which I consider incredibly pernicious, that students hurt feelings and upset and perceptions that a professor, without any objective evidence whatsoever, and in my case, there was no objective evidence, and in fact, findings of an outside investigation to the effect that I had never discriminated against any students. Regardless of that, student feeling that I could possibly not be fair, or other vague reservations on the part of students were considered the sort of thing that couldn't be questioned or somehow had to be indulged. And heterodox got on that bandwagon in a way that I think really disappointed me and made me think that heterodox was not going to be terribly useful when it came to right of center professors like me who tried to introduce positions or ideas or facts that the lefties that control academia did not want students to hear. So, bottom line here, heterodox has not been useful in my case, not really recently helped me in any way.
Hmm. Well, it's tremendously disappointing because Jonathan Haidt talked a very good talk. in the early days, and he seemed like a tremendous gift for those of us who had dissenting views. I mean, he really came down hard on this culture of conformity and censorship, and was drawing attention to how it had
Yes.
corrupted science, and especially not just social psychology, but other areas of science. Um, and
And
of course,
recently he's come out against DEI. He gave a speech recently, which I haven't heard, but I've read about, that he is now saying that diversity, inclusion, and equity departments have no place on campus, and that they are pernicious, and that they defeat the whole purpose of college education. So he said. So that is a kind of hardening of his position. But I think the problem with Jonathan is that he is a person of the left, and so he's kind of instinctually sympathetic to some of the bizarre therapeutic assumptions that prevail on the left. He doesn't even know that he's indulging them, and he wants to please and placate the left, which is a disease that infects people across the political spectrum, and not piss off his allies. I'm trying to explain what's going on, but those are my best explanations.
so this brings up the question, which we've been talking about for a few years, which is where all this comes from, where wokeism comes from, right? So now, recently, the two popular theories are the ones associated with Chris Rufo and Richard Hanania. Rufo traces a philosophical story. And so there was a group of philosophers, the critical theorists like Herbert Marcuse and
Right.
his followers, who came up with the idea of classifying people into oppressed and oppressors. And and their plan was this long march through the institutions, and so they took over the institutions. Now, when you read his book, it's not entirely clear how that happened on his account. It's just they came up with the idea, and then they became professors at Harvard, and then
Right. Why
they
the
taught their
idea
students.
caught on, why it was so popular and so appealing, that is, there's not really a satisfying explanation for that in the book.
Now, I actually like the book a lot, and there's like a lot
Yeah.
of interesting history and details of the philosophy, which are quite fascinating. But in terms of explaining causality, I felt that in that respect it was missing something. Now, Hanania's theory is that wokeism, or a large part of wokeism, goes back to law. It's a product of law, especially civil rights law. The civil rights law says, basically, you've got to be woke. You have to have, if not quotas, you have to have de facto quotas, because if you don't have certain racial groups represented at a sufficient level, then this is evidence of discrimination. It's assumed to be discrimination unless you can prove otherwise. And so in order to avoid discrimination suits, people have to, even though they're not allowed to have quotas, they have to find some way of having de facto quotas and bringing people who look a certain way into their university or company. And then this creates a culture of being very sensitive about race and acting in a way so that you can avoid workplace discrimination suits and that kind of thing. And now my beef with Hanania's theory is that when you look at the story he tells, the original civil rights law said there can't be discrimination, against whites or men, there can't be quotas. It was crystal clear that all of that stuff was not allowed. It was written into the law. It was clearly stated by the people who wrote the law. And yet, the judges and the bureaucrats and all the people who actually implement and enforce the law decided that it would mean quotas and DEI. And that is what needed an explanation. The law itself is not that bad. Just don't discriminate against people. If we followed that law as it was intended, it wouldn't be such a big deal. The problem was how the establishment interpreted the law and basically imposed wokeism on everybody. The question is, why were they woke? Why did the establishment want wokeism? And that's something that Hanania kind of treats it, on my reading, as a law of nature. Well, yeah, of course, when it's in the hands of the judges, they would want quotas. They would want to take away people's freedom in order to ensure equal representation. So my suggestion had been that woke law and woke philosophy stem from another thing, which is the equality thesis. The idea that everybody is, or all groups are born with the same distribution of traits, and therefore any differences in outcome must be environmental. In practice, that means it's going to be, disparities are going to be blamed on white racism or sexism or something like that. And wokeism is simply the attempt to correct for that racism and sexism. And the establishment adopted woke philosophy and woke law because they followed the equality thesis to its logical conclusion. Now, something that we have debated is in order to defeat wokeism, what kind of confrontation do we need to have with the big lie that motivates it? So Amy has distinguished soft realism from hard realism. So soft realism is most associated with someone like Thomas Sowell, who says that disparities are not the result of discrimination, or at least not directly, but they are the result of cultural forces which, on some soft realist views, shouldn't be blamed on anybody. So it's not right to blame whites, or certainly not living white people, for disparities that are unfavorable to, say, blacks. And this could be a solution: teach people soft realism, that it's just the fault of the culture, and then people would let up on the wokeism DEI stuff. Hard realism, which is the kind that I have advocated, traces these disparities to a large extent to genetic differences. And the hard realist says a certain amount of differences in outcomes are just the result of nature, and it's not something that is morally problematic, and we should find some way to just to live with it. Of course, the critics say that that's naive, and that soft realism may be just more realistic.
Well, I mean, just to comment on all of that, I mean, you and I are in agreement, I think, on the sort of origin, the fons et origin of both the Rufo elaborate kind of window dressing, philosophical window dressing of wokeism, which undeniably, is powerful and exists and has been generated by all of these theorists that Rufo talks about. Definitely that is out there. Certainly in, the fancier, more theoretical realms, it lends a lot of power to the whole woke opinion shaping institutions at the highest level. So it's not like he's not talking about something real. He is. And then Hanania also has, I think, a uh, very enlightening description of a piece of what wokeism is about, which is how the law has morphed. The civil rights law have morphed from a very simple concept that's called disparate treatment, the prohibition on treating people because of race, because of sex, or based on those characteristics, which actually would keep intact the meritocracy, would forbid quotas because quotas violate that prohibition. They are race conscious. In fact, as written, the civil rights laws were intended to be race blind. Okay. And all of that morphed into something entirely different, which was a focus on bringing about racial parity or equal or proportional results. And that really wasn't the way the laws were intended. It wasn't the way they were written, but somehow this transformation took place. And I think Hanania, very accurately um, documents that. But he doesn't, at the end of the day, really explain it. Right. So the way to really explain it is to go back to a much more fundamental idea. And that is the idea of, I will call it equalitarianism, I guess, riffing off of Bo Weingard and his writings in Aporia, on the Aporia website, but others who have talked about this. The idea that all groups are equally well equipped, equally well endowed, they're the same. They don't differ in their traits, their abilities, their competencies, or their preferences for that matter, their characteristics. And I won't go into, where that idea comes from. It's very deeply rooted. It has religious origins. It has philosophical origins. It's a post-Enlightenment idea. It's there, and it's very powerful, and it has the grip of sort of a religious commitment, shall we say. And it's very, very hard to dislodge it. And it leads directly in a direct line to wokeness. Wokeness, in effect, says that if there's any deviation from the equal results, the proportional results, then the reasons for it are, by definition, nefarious. They have to do, they have their foundation in white racism, white prejudice, white supremacy, evil forces which blame whites for all of these problems because, of course, whites and now Asians as white adjacent are the ones who have the advantages when we line up the different groups. This is illegitimate. Society has to be completely reformed and transformed to eliminate this result, and that includes getting rid of meritocratic criteria, which are a nefarious creation of white supremacy, um, getting rid of Western civilization, which maintains all of these structures, essentially leveling everything that our society is founded upon. And in order to do that, we divide the world into oppressor and oppressed. We draw the sort of these structures from Chris Rufo's uh, gallery of rogues. It all kind of fits together. Um, and I agree with you that trying to purge this horrible uh, philosophical set of or ideological set of commitments um, does require trouncing the premise of equalitarianism, that we're not blank slates, we're not the same, groups are not the same. Uh, and you can either do it in a soft way by pointing to culture, or you can do it in a hard way by saying that these differences are partly the product of innate characteristics. I think it's a straw man to say that they are even largely a product. They are at least partly and significantly a product. I think there is always a kind of social, cultural element to these differences. We can talk more about that, and I have specific ideas about how society as a whole has failed groups like blacks and enabled them or facilitated, I think, widening of the gaps that have occurred. So that's kind of a separate discussion. But what, I think what we're all grappling with right now, those of us who want to return to the original meaning of the civil rights laws, to color blindness, to going back to kind of colorblind meritocratic regime in many, if not most, areas of life. And I don't think we can do it in every area of life. We can talk a little bit about that too, but certainly in employment, in education, in any area where ability and competence matter and where our society depends on ability and competence, our highly technological society. Um, Returning to that, how do we get people to accept that return and the consequences of it, which will be that we will not have parity, as you have put it in your Substack. And of course, the focus here is on blacks because they're the ones who are lagging. That there will be virtually no or close to no blacks in a number of positions that are very highly cognitively and intellectually demanding. At the pinnacle of certain professions, like executives in technology, uh, academic, demanding academic, quasi-scientific fields, academic medicine. We could list these positions, being a physics professor at Harvard, uh, anything that requires a very high degree of smarts. Blacks will be outcompeted in any meritocracy. I mean, I think the numbers just show that without escape.
You
Will
brought up.
people accept that? How can we get society to accept that? I actually put that question to Coleman Hughes, who has just written a book in favor of colorblindness. I think a pretty good and nuanced book to bring back colorblind meritocracy. I said, well, what are you going to do about the fact that then blacks will be shut out of a lot of positions? And he said, I have no pat answer to that. Well, I said, you're in good company. I don't know anybody who has a pat answer to that, frankly.
Yeah,
Except
what happens when people see the
the
representation in
results,
certain positions change dramatically?
which it
What
will.
Yeah, what are you supposed to say? Well, that's Thomas Sowell says it's okay, so
Well,
we
I
should be
mean, I
colorblind.
don't have a problem with it. You see, I myself would not be disturbed by it because I don't have a commitment to this idea of parity. I'm not an equalitarian, and that just doesn't speak to me at all. In fact, I understand why people just generally would prefer people like themselves, and I see the benefits of uniformity as opposed to diversity, and people seeking out like-minded and like-abled people. So I'm just not into this whole mindset. It wouldn't bother me if there were more of one kind of person in certain sectors of society or the
But
world and less of others. But how can we get more people to be like me?
well, your mindset has been influenced by your knowledge of the empirical reality,
Absolutely.
right? So the question is there any other route to changing everyone else's mindset that doesn't involve informing them of the same thing that you know about? And would soft realism, because the idea is soft realism is in less tension with respect to the taboo. So soft realism is also taboo a little bit, right? Because you're saying that there's something that could be improved about the culture of underperforming groups, and that's kind of problematic to say that and taboo
Well, it
to say that.
depends on who you talk to. I mean, if you are in knowledge forming institutions like the university or the mainstream media or, the guardians of political correct thought, you don't even get to there's actually a three-step process here that's going on. You don't even get to step one. What is step one? Step one is even acknowledging these differences. I mean, to get people to acknowledge that there is a group IQ gap, that there is, for example, a one standard deviation IQ gap between blacks and whites, that is a heavy lift in some quarters.
The British press likes to refer to this as like Coffness's claim or
Well,
his
right, a
assertion.
claim. It's a fact. I'm sorry. It's one of the most, as Steven Pinker says, the most strongly and most well established facts in all of social science. It's really beyond doubt at this point, and the result keeps coming up over and over and over again in every test of cognitive ability that is ever given, like from the SAT to IQ test to armed forces qualifying tests to the LSAT. Over and over again, we see this intransigent one standard deviation difference. Now, the second, sort of 1B, the second part of the first step, if people will like grudgingly even admit that this difference exists, is that this difference is significant. So even if people might be forced to admit that there is this gap, right, because it's very hard to deny that if you're at all intellectually honest, there are people who will say, well, it's, what significance is it? Why do we care about it? Why does it matter? Right? And that launches you on the social science of, what predicts social outcomes and performance. And there is, yes, a huge and very well done body of studies that shows that IQ predicts lots of stuff and predicts it very well and predicts it better than anything else. Is it perfect? No, but it is a highly useful predictive instrument. And even an institution like Yale University recently brought back the SAT. I was stunned because they said, well, why we brought it back? Because every one of our studies indicates that your score on this test, which is essentially kind of an IQ test, it's very correlated with IQ, predicts your performance at Yale better than anything else. So they're kind of rediscovering these truths, which have been around for a very long time. So before you can even get to soft realism and hard realism, you need to get people to pay attention to the gaps, accept the gaps, and accept the significance of the gaps. And that's a hard problem.
Hanania a few days ago came out with a follow-up piece.
Yes.
Shut up about the IQ difference.
Race and IQ.
Shut
up about race
Shut
and
about
IQ.
race and IQ. Now, so he had a few arguments. First, he gave some examples of hereditarians who are still woke. So they became hereditarian, but they didn't give up wokism, or
Right.
they retained core elements of wokism.
Like
So
Freddie
therefore,
DeBoer.
therefore,
Paige
according to
Barton.
Hanania,
Yeah.
therefore, it can't be that hereditarianism is the cure for wokeism, because look at those counterexamples. Now, I don't think that's a very good argument. Of course, values take time. They're sticky. It takes time for people to change. You don't, we're not machines that, we've updated our belief here and now I'm going to make all of my beliefs consistent and reconcile them with the new information. That's not how it works. And people are still influenced by their surroundings, and other people are reinforcing wokeism. So, of course, some people are just very logical, and now the probability of hereditarianism has gone up, and therefore I adjust my the social policies that I advocate now have to be revised, and the following logical ways. Some people think like that, but maybe Freddie DeBoer doesn't think like that. So yeah, you found a counterexample. That doesn't mean that wokeism isn't basically what happened when people as a society kind of thought through the implications of the equality thesis and ran up against the fact that there are these persistent disparities, and then wokeism was the response. So I just I don't I was not convinced by that at all. He also said arguments don't work. It doesn't make a difference. I guess presumably he thinks arguments work for some people. He thinks arguments work for him, but for other people, arguments don't work. Well, yes, you can come up with examples of people who are resistant to argument. That's a very easy thing to do. But the idea that we're not responsive on some level to argument, especially people in the elite, it just doesn't. I just don't see the basis for that. And he could have said that not too long ago in history. It would have seemed like a pipe dream that people would give up on biblical literalism, that they would believe in evolution. A lot of things. People changed their mind as a result of evidence. It didn't happen immediately. There were people who were dogmatic, and they'll go to their graves believing what they were taught when they were in grade school. There's nothing you can do about that. But the idea that by making great arguments and presenting people with really clear, convincing evidence for something, that you're not going to start or get a certain number of people on your side. There is no evidence for that. That's just made up. And he said that, well, if people responded to evidence, they would have already believed this stuff because the bell curve is well known and this information is available on the internet. But as you're saying, people don't even know that there's a gap. People don't know anything. Yes, the information, theoretically, it's available, but nobody has any, most people who have been educated, in the normal way, they don't take it seriously. They don't think it's real. They think they have no way to distinguish like some neo-Nazi rambling on Stormfront from Arthur Jensen. To them, it's all, how do they know how to distinguish it? So they just believe whatever they read on Wikipedia. So, yeah, I don't know about you, but that's why I didn't find the Hanania shut up about.
Yeah. Well, I think there were some problems with that piece. I really like Richard Hanania as a kind of bold thinker. I mean, that doesn't mean that I always agree with him, far from it. But I think this piece was particularly kind of a dog's breakfast, and that at times I was not even sure what he was arguing. It is very interesting that there are a few people who adhere to wokeism or a variation on wokeism, even though they are willing to face not just these IQ gaps, but even the possibility that they might have to do with endowments that we can't manipulate. So there aren't very many people like that. And even Freddie DeBoer, I reviewed his book. He's willing to admit it for individuals. When it comes to groups, he balks. Okay. So even the people who are hereditarians on the left, they balk at innate basis for group differences. But let's just say that there would be people who might come to embrace hereditary basis for group differences, even though they're people of the left. How could that be reconciled? Well, I think it can be reconciled because, and I forget where this is argued, maybe in your essay somewhere, or Bo Weingart says this. Innate differences are endowments, and lefties, part of their belief system is that we should compensate people for poor endowments, that are not their fault. I mean, if anything is not a person's fault, it's that he was born less smart.
Mm.
The real question arises that standard issue, luck egalitarian idea. right, which is a lefty idea. The problem is, right, that there are different ways to compensate people for unfortunate endowments. It's one thing to say, well, we have to be solicitous towards less smart people. We have to maybe distribute resources to them. We have to give them extra chances. We have to find jobs that they can do. In other words, measures that are geared to the reality of their abilities versus saying, well, because it's not their fault that they can't be a surgeon, we'll still make them a surgeon anyway. There's Larry Alexander, professor at San Diego, said, that's crazy. I mean, if a truck runs over a surgeon and his arm is severed and it's not his fault, someone did it to him, we don't say, well, we have to compensate you by letting you operate anyway, right? I mean, that's sort of an extreme form of compensation that ignores the meritocracy. So what it really comes down to is the right way to compensate people for poor endowments to just demolish the meritocracy, sweep away everything that we depend on in our society to make it a functional society, or find some other way to help people with unfortunate endowments. And that brings me to the second problem with Hananiah's piece, which is he says almost nothing about the existential threat of wokeism, the central existential threat, which is the war on merit, competence, measures of competence, uh, all of the kind of basic commitments of so-called white society or Western society, right, or the Enlightenment, to rewards to merit as being best for society as a whole, because we want people in positions where they can put their talents to best use. They want to get rid of all of that. And that is a very destructive and threatening element of wokeism that he just barely acknowledges in his essay, right? We can shut up about race and IQ because wokeism isn't all that bad, and we can find other avenues to banish wokeism. There's no evidence for that, of
But
course.
it was kind of difficult to square with his previous position, because he wrote a book about how to get rid of wokeism and how to fight it. And one
And how
interpretation,
important it is to do it. Yeah,
and how we
and
need our
why
freedom
it's a
back.
threat.
I mean, he says we should fight wokeism by saying that, praising freedom and saying that we can get rid of wokeism by, but people have largely given
Right,
up
with
on freedom.
liberty-based arguments, but he's the one who says arguments don't work. I mean, but let me get to the arguments don't work part. That's part three, right? There are probably other parts to his argument that I just didn't really get, but arguments do work sometimes. Some arguments work. Here's an argument that works. I mean, the way that wokeism has played out is an example of arguments working, right? So we start from the premise that all groups are equal, equal in their capacities, equal in their endowments, their intelligence, their competence. And we look out in the world and we see that we have unequal positions and results. And we then buy the argument, it is an argument after all, that if that's the case, we have to find what caused that and who's to blame. Oh, the only thing that makes sense is that this being socially constructed, that the people in charge of social construction, aka white people, are to blame. Well, that's an argument. That's an argument that's caught on like wildfire, right?
So this is my suggestion: is that this is why smart people are disproportionately woke, is because smart people did follow the argument. Everybody
Absolutely.
everybody accepts that people are the same, at least in the mainstream. I'm certainly like the National Review, American conservative kind of crowd. This is what they say they believe, and
Right. So I think that the result of this, the kind of take home lesson is don't give up on arguments. I am the first person to concede that, reason, arguments, logic are not, always efficacious, that there's a lot of irrationality, a lot of appeal to emotion. But the arguments that get carried along, actually, Jonathan Haidt talks about this, are the ones that appeal to uh, the emotions that have deep resonance, and equalitarianism has deep resonance. But there are other visions of social life that also used to have deep resonance, right? Which is that merit is important, which is the liberty to achieve at your highest level, which is the sense of responsibility that capable people have to contribute, to be slotted into positions where they can do the most good, that we ought to have a system like that, that everybody has equal dignity if they play their part in society. Well, we've lost that idea. That is an idea that we need to bring back,
But,
uh,
but
you
well,
know,
Hanania
exploring that.
says like, well, that this is just an impossible idea. He seems to now treat it as a law of nature that people just can't accept inequality, and that um, I'm not, that race realists are asking for a revolution in human nature. I saw Hanania and other people were making comments like this, but
Yeah, but people used to accept. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, right, that people accepted these kinds of inequalities as just the way things were. I mean, you don't even have
probably
to go back to the founding.
Neanderthals accepted it. Maybe even Homo erectus would have known that they're different from us. Like
Well, no, our
for me,
founders accepted it.
uh,
People in the 1940s accepted it. People in the
it was only
1950s,
until like 2 generations ago where, well, it goes
two
back a little.
generations.
It goes
Although
back a
we're
little
starting to
farther.
collapse. Yes.
Because that you can trace it back to these like philosophers like John Locke is, as far as I could tell, the first person to really state this very clearly, that we're just blank sheets of paper and every group is probably the same. Although I doubt that this was really believed by a lot of people until later. And somebody like John Stuart Mill, um, some of the French philosophers, they probably sort of believed it. But and then it really started catching on, like in the 1880s, early 20th century, among a small group of liberal intellectuals, and then somehow it just became established and really took off a few generations ago.
Well, I think one of the problems is that given the nature of our society, which is highly cognitively demanding and technologically sophisticated, where a lot of the rewards go to people who are very smart, is that we have this kind of fetish about IQ. We have, the cult of smart, as De Boer calls it. And, I think we need to find ways to temper the cult of smart and bring back the notion that if you live a good and virtuous life and fulfill your roles and do what adults are supposed to do, which is work and to the extent they can be self supporting and contribute to society, get married, have children, be a good citizen, be a good neighbor, all of that stuff, that people who are, not as smart can acquire dignity and respect. I think we have created a society, the elites have created a society where it's either Yale or jail, right? I often tell people, only 20% of people can be in the top 20%. We need a society in which the average person can achieve some conception of the good life. And we have, on some level, abandoned that through our moral deregulation in the wake of the 60s. And this brings me back to the ways in which society is responsible for, I think, some of the problems that the Black community has, which is we've kind of abandoned our role to provide guidance, standards, expectations, right, and guideposts for people who are average or below average. And so the differences that we're seeing are ironically widening in many ways. And we just feel more and more urgency to have to close those gaps. But there are other ways of doing it besides lying to ourselves about differences in ability on this, the sort of smartest ability, because there are many other attributes that people have that are important, and uh, bring and trying to create a society in which people at all ability levels can lead the good life. The other thing that is a piece of that that's very important is enforcing the law and obeying the law. I think there is not enough emphasis on order, social order, and the catastrophic effects of our attempt to demolish and denature our criminal justice system, right? Because that widens the gap between the people who have and have not ability. What's happening in our society is that people of high ability are engaging in white flight. They are barricading themselves in very, very expensive neighborhoods where they live with other people with high earning power, other people like them, other people who are do not engage in criminal activity, and they're leaving everybody else to these very dangerous, dubious places. So there are all sorts of ways in which I think we have promoted a kind of cult of smart, which has ironically fueled the desire that everybody be equally smart.
Uh,
We
well,
just
I think
fetishize this.
there's an idea that your moral worth is a function of intelligence, intellectual
Right.
ability. Uh, Now, a solution that this is something I'm planning to write about soon. That is advocated by Charles Murray and Noah Carl. Is well, it has little or nothing to do with your moral worth, your IQ. It's just
Well, and it doesn't
not
have
related.
nothing to do with it,
No.
because, in fact, there is a correlation between IQ and criminality, but it's a correlation that we have allowed to widen and to accentuate because we have given up on the prioritization of social order and obedience to law. So we've made it worse.
Well,
I,
I'll get it in more details in my post on this, but I am not on board with this. I Intelligence really is a valuable thing, and there's our ability to contemplate and experience, have certain kinds of experiences, and so on, is related to intelligence, which doesn't mean that intelligence is the same thing as moral worth. That's the only thing that matters. How fast you can run also matters. How athletic you are, how kind you are. All these things matter. But intelligence is something which has, in my view, intrinsic value, and I don't think
No, and I'm
we should
not,
minimize.
Nathan. I think that's a really important point, because I think that the old fashioned way of looking at things valorizes excellence and achievement and people who are extraordinary in their accomplishments. I don't think you have to give up any of that. In fact, I think you would be inclined to embrace it, right? If you abandoned wokeism. But that is not synonymous with or the same as moral worth in the full sense, by which I mean living a virtuous, admirable life. I think the two are can be teased apart. I mean, excellence is a form of worth, absolutely, but I am not sure I would call it a form of moral worth. Now, it is true that if you are very, very smart, you may have a greater capacity to do good for a greater number of people. Like if you discover a cancer treatment or something like that, uh, the potential for that is there, or you're more likely to engage in self control
Because
or
if
live.
discovering a cancer treatment has moral value, then we have whatever value you have plus the cancer treatment that you're going to produce. So,
Okay,
uh,
okay, but not everybody produces a cancer treatment. Not every smart person produces a cancer treatment. So there may be some overlap, But that doesn't mean that there isn't moral worth left over for people who are not that smart. There are a lot of different ways in which people who are not that smart can exemplify moral worth and acquire moral worth. And it's true, they're shut out of the kind of heroic excellence that super smart people have the potential for, okay? But that doesn't mean that, there's no ilk of moral worth that average people can't exemplify. And I think it's really important to respect that, to expect and respect that. And I just think there's been too little emphasis on it. It's
And
not an either or thing.
as Nietzsche says, the people at the top of the pyramid require the bottom of the pyramid in order to have
Well, okay.
their place.
I mean, I don't say no to that, but let me point out something that's sort of orthogonal to this, which is yes, maybe the potential for really smart people to display something akin to moral worth is greater, or there are potentials there that less smart people wouldn't be able to exploit or have. But then there are people at the top of the IQ food chain who are really evil people, uh, exemplify anti-moral worth and have the potential to do great harm as a result of their
Well,
extraordinary
sometimes they
ability.
do great harm and they do great positive things. And there
Right, they
isn't
do great everything.
there,
So
there's a very weak correlation, if any correlation, I think, between like talent and being a good person or
it's a weak correlation, very weak.
in
There may
terms of
be
like following
some.
the law. Like people who are super smart don't go around like stabbing people just because that's a dumb thing to do. But they
Go around stealing from people.
they commit big crimes
Yeah.
sometimes.
And they commit fewer crimes. I mean, there's data that lockstep. I've seen a chart recently that for white boys, it's true for blacks too, but there's always that gap. White boys, the more wealthy the family is, or the higher the earnings of the family in which they grow up, the less likely they are to be arrested. All right, so there's just kind of this lockstep linear relationship between. So it is true in our society, and maybe it's more contingent than intrinsic because it's always hard to know when you see a phenomenon how much of it is constructed and how much of it is just intransigent for any of this stuff. But in our society, at least, yeah, dumber people have more of a tendency to engage in criminal behavior. Smarter people have less of a tendency, but it's not zero at the top. It's not.
They have less tendency to engage in overt criminal behavior, but that
Or
is
violent
largely, yeah,
criminal,
especially
violent
violent.
criminal.
But if they had an opportunity where they could actually benefit by being violent uh, or doing or then they might change their behavior. So in our society, the smart thing to do is just is not to mug people, not to murder people. But
Right,
and under a different system, I don't think there's
and not to
any
break the
intrinsic
law.
connection.
Yeah,
Yeah, if the
yeah,
law said from now on you are part of a special class and you're allowed to murder people from the other
sure.
class.
Sure. We're talking about our society here, primarily. There are truly dysfunctional systems. I mean, there are systems that are so dysfunctional that um, a lot of these generalizations and assumptions, just don't apply. Where it really pays to break the rules all the time. But we're not really talking about those. Actually, most societies are like that. Unfortunately, we're kind of being very Teutonic and Nordic and Anglo here, and confining ourselves to well-ordered Western societies, which are in the minority. They are definitely in the minority. But anyway, to get back to the main point, I mean, the main point is that it's important to have a society in which there are, there is recognition of, there is respect for what ordinary people can achieve and do achieve and are expected to achieve. And I think that we have somewhat lost our way because our upper classes are so insular, they're so focused on themselves, they're so, I think, cut off from ordinary people geographically, socially, culturally. I mean, it's Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, which is a brilliant book. As with so much that Charles Murray writes, he is presages or identifies social trends that are just right in front of our nose, but that people don't really pay much attention to. And so that insularity and that separation means that there's a sense in which elites really don't care about, they purport to care about people that are less well off, but they really don't, frankly, in any meaningful sense.
So, last thing that I wanted to talk about is why we failed to take over any important institutions, and particularly academia, which is the one that we have experience with. So I said that smart people lean woke, they lean left, lean woke, because wokeism is a logical consequence of this empirical premise that is accepted by almost everybody. So smart people just follow correctly, figure out that implies wokeism. And so the elite is inevitable. As long as we accept the equality thesis, the elite's gonna lean woke. I mean, it's very challenging for us to do any kind of to accomplish anything collectively, given the deficiency of human capital on our side, and that's just there's no way around it. Like our institutions have a lot of problems, and the kinds of people who the right appoints as its leaders, with some important exceptions, but in many cases, taking people who really should not be leaders for numerous reasons, and then lavishing attention and money upon them is the kind of thing that happens on our side. And then when there's and then on the other side, yes, of course, there's a lot of stupidity on the woke side. There's a lot of stuff that happens at universities, which is ridiculous. Yes, that's true. But still, the mass of intelligence tends to be against us. And it's very hard to know what is the path to victory is going to require some kind of collective action. And yet, I mean, we don't have even, it's not clear that we have enough right-wing intellectuals to even take over a university, a serious university. How do we work with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, a big problem. I don't purport to have, all the answers here. A lot of it is very puzzling to me. Partly it's puzzling to me because, I have accepted race realism, and I know a lot of very smart people who are race realists, or when push comes to shove, accept various versions of race realism. Now, what you're saying, and it's undeniably true, is that although those people may exist and you and I know them, right, they are in the minority, in the distinct minority of people who are, technically smart, high IQ, right, by measured IQ. And of course, a lot of those people are what I would call stupid smart people, because they believe a lot of silly lefty ideas. So they may seem smart, but and you and I disagree on whether the nutty right is, a bigger force than the nutty left. I actually think there are various ways you can slice the bologna here in terms of percentage, absolute numbers, etc. There is a nutty right and a nutty left, but the nutty left seems to have captured even people who would be more inclined to reasonable and moderate views through a process of intimidation. And the key to that process of intimidation is to accuse people of racism. For some reason, a reason that is a color I don't see because I have no racial guilt, people are just mesmerized and frightened by the possibility that they will be accused of racism. So that, I think, is a lot of the source of power. It all goes back to racial guilt, this equalitarian obsession and delusion that gives lefties a lot of power. Um, what else is going on? I mean, there is a feminization phenomenon that I think is underestimated. I have said in the past that the university, when women started coming in great numbers, it started to incorporate the values of the nursery and the kindergarten and displace the values of rational thinking, sportsmanship, rigor, debate, male, masculine proclivities with feminine proclivities. And that has really ruined academia, large swaths of academia, unfortunately. And it's in the process of ruining other parts of academia that are relative holdouts, like philosophy and economics and areas like that, and the hard sciences, even, right? Um, and women, for reasons that I don't completely understand, tend to lean much more left than men. Okay, so when they come into these institutions turn left. So there are a lot of different forces at work here, and the Republican Party is an utter failure in holding the line against these sorts of changes, right? But at the end of the day, I think where it really starts and where the action really is, if we're going to try and change it, maybe not understanding why it is the way it is, but try to change it, is in K through 12 education. And I am more and more interested in trying to reform K through 12 education. It's partly influenced by my perspective as a law professor. I see elite students, the best and the brightest, at Penn Law, who are the product of this education system, right? And they tell me, the ones who are interested in conservative ideas, who are a little bit renegade, who are questioning some of the woke catechism, because they're the ones who seek me out, and there are a fair number, they're in the minority. When I ask them about their prior educational experience, they tell me horror stories going all the way back to kindergarten. That is really
Yeah,
where the
this is
leftist propaganda starts.
the values that are imprinted with at that age, very hard to shake.
Very hard to shake. I
And
mean, if they started in college, I think it would be far weaker. But it starts in preschool and in kindergarten, and it is accelerated recently. I mean, the gloves are off. The education establishment, is just overtly propagandistic and partial and tilted, right? And it is inculcating students with a particular point of view to the point where they don't even get exposed to alternative or mainstream, what used to be mainstream type
yeah,
ideas.
absolutely. And the right spends way too much focus on higher education relative to
Absolutely.
K to 12. If we had a bunch of conservatives teaching K to 12, the students would come to college and demand conservatism.
Well, they would be much more open to it.
Yeah.
They could at least have exposure. I mean, we're talking about utterly clueless about any alternative points of view. For example, the big one, well, one is sexuality has no place in K through 12. When I talk about this topic, I joke about Troy, New York in the 1950s and 60s, which is where I was educated. And I mean, the rules weren't even written down. Sex was not mentioned. It was verboten to even, talk about your own personal life, let alone anything had to do with sexuality or homosexuality, homosexuality was just absolutely not a part of what the schools were there to teach about. Okay, and in terms of race and history, I mean, we did get some balance there, but we also got a lot of information about our system, our Constitution, our values, Western Civ, the glories of Western Civ, which are now taboo. You can't say nice things about European civilization. That is considered white supremacy in K through 12. That's insane. I mean, that's our system, that's our society, that's what we are built on, and it's banished. It's indoctrination of the worst kind, to hate America, to hate Western achievements, to not even expose children to those achievements. Um, we have It is extreme. What is going on is extreme. And when people ask me, what can I do? I give them, young people, mostly male, of course. I say, well, two things: get married, have kids, and run for your school board. That is where it all begins. And that is where we have to take power. This is a political problem. It's a political problem that's secondary to an attitudinal problem,
And
right?
so, yeah, there's not going to be a revolution overnight. That it's going to be millions of people arguing it out. You know, as I say in the post, over Thanksgiving dinner, or over the
Right.
water cooler, and presenting the arguments and slowly turning a certain number of people over to our side. Now, as far as the universities are concerned, I mean, a lot of people have made this observation that there's just a very serious problem with the incentive system, with the way people are selected,
Right.
and it's very, uh, you know, difficult for. It was always difficult, but now, even more so for people with different point of view, or people who were maybe more willing to criticize the orthodoxy, to make it through all these filters, from high school to college to graduate school, to getting a postdoc, getting a job, getting tenure. At every stage, at every class you take, you're being tested for conformity, um, your willingness to follow rules and accept the ideology that's being imposed on you, even when it's illogical. And uh, you end up with a population that just doesn't have, even if they have a high IQ, which in some cases they do, they do have that. Their personality, by both nature and conditioning, has been so diminished that it's very difficult for them to see them taking a stand for something.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've been talking about education reform. I think K through 12, there's just almost no limit on the reforms that we could implement in K through 12 if we had the political will and the strength to do it. Because it's the creature of the state, and teachers have no First Amendment rights, and what the state scripts them to do is what they do. It would be possible to have a vast overfull. For higher ed, it's a much harder nut to crack. Much harder nut to crack for a lot of different reasons. One is the First Amendment kicks in, where you have state schools anyway, and the First Amendment, because we're dealing with adults, not children. and I would draw a very sharp line between adults and children. So it's very hard for governments and legislatures to go in and control what people can say, what people can think, etc. Um, and the second is we have these very strong but informal conventions about self-governance, institutional self-governance in higher ed, right, where the faculty is in control of who gets admitted, who gets promoted, what projects are deemed worthy, etc. It's a very self-perpetuating system. It's insular. It's opaque. There's no clear ways of oversight, no clear methods of oversight. There are claims of expertise. I mean, it's very, very hard. I have some ideas about how to sort of get inside that system. I think you have to use the spending power. This is maybe, since time is running out here, this could be the topic of another discussion of using the government spending power, because there is a fact that we know, which is that every institution in the United States, public or private, of higher education, with a few exceptions, takes hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money. And that federal money provides a lever, right? If you're willing to use that lever and have
This is
political
the problem with our side being the dumb one, is that even when we get power, we don't know how to use it.
we don't use it
effectively.
wisely and shrewdly. Yes,
Right.
but
They'll give it to something ridiculous, or some like Christian center at the university, or a great books program.
But Nathan,
Because
you're too skeptical. I knew people in the Trump administration who were very savvy and very sharp and understood the problem, and they get it. Okay, they get what needs to be done, and the obstacles to doing it, including Trump himself being, preoccupied with other things, many of which are kind of stupid and narcissistic, instead of sticking to the last. Um, if there was the will, those people would, I think, make very smart reforms and use this lever of the spending power to do a lot more, including making the process more transparent, a kind of Rooney rule where you have to see a list of candidates for positions. If the person who was hired, there has to be an explanation and a justification. That sounds really cumbersome, and people in academia won't like it at all. But given that there is this capture by the left, something has to be done about it. It is a crisis. It is a real problem. And you have to recognize it as a problem, and you have to see bringing balance to academia for the sake of the students. For pedagogical reasons, we need more balance in academia, and we can justify that. We just need the will, and we need people who are committed to it and know how to do it. Now, I know you're very skeptical that we have any of that, but
well,
I don't think it would take that many people. But once again, we can't really explore this topic in the next 5 minutes. Which is all
okay.
we
Well,
really
anyway, like Herbert Marcuse, we have a plan to take everything back,
right.
take back K to 12, and one day they'll
Then take
they'll
back
work.
higher ed, but we have to start with K through 12. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.